the Allies had a massive problem. They'd just broken through Nazi defenses in Normandy, but their tanks were literally running on empty. Every single day, Patton's Third Army alone was burning through 400,000 gallons of fuel. That's not a typo. And here's the thing, all that fuel was sitting back at the beaches hundreds of miles away from where the fighting was happening. So what did they do? They created the most insane supply operation you've never heard of. Picture this, 6,000 trucks racing down French roads day and night, no stops allowed, drivers falling asleep at the wheel, some trucks literally exploding from exhaustion. They called it the Red Ball Express, and without it, the Nazis might have actually stopped the Allied advance cold. This is the story of how truck drivers, not tanks, not planes, not special forces, became the secret weapon that crushed Hitler's armies. And the craziest part? Most of these drivers had never even driven a truck before D-Day. Let me paint you a picture of what was happening in August 1944. The Allies had just pulled off something nobody thought was possible. They'd broken out of Normandy after being stuck there for weeks. General Patton's tanks were racing across France so fast that even the Germans couldn't believe it. One German commander literally refused to believe the reports because he thought it was impossible for tanks to move that quickly. But here's what nobody talks about. Those tanks? They got about half a mile per gallon. Yeah, you heard that right. Half a mile. A single Sherman tank needed 150 gallons just to go 75 miles. And Patton had hundreds of them. The math was brutal. The Third Army alone needed 750,000 gallons of supplies every single day just to keep moving. That's fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, spare parts, everything an army needs to fight. And remember, this is 1944. There's no modern logistics system. No computers tracking shipments. Just paper, radios, and a whole lot of chaos. The supply officers were pulling their hair out. They had all this stuff, mountains of it, sitting at the beaches and ports. But the front lines were now 300, sometimes 400 miles away. The railways were destroyed because, well, the Allies had bombed them to stop the Germans from using them. Kind of shot themselves in the foot there. So you've got Patton on the radio screaming for fuel. His tanks are literally stopping in the middle of their advance because they're running on empty. At one point, the entire Third Army ground to a halt. Not because the Germans stopped them. Because they ran out of gas. Can you imagine? You're winning the war, the enemy is running, and you have to stop because nobody can get you fuel. The logistics guys tried everything. They had something called the communications zone, which was supposed to handle all the supplies. But it was a bureaucratic nightmare. Everything had to go through proper channels, get the right paperwork, follow the correct procedures. Meanwhile, Patton sending his own guys with Tommy guns to hijack fuel trucks meant for other units. True story. They even tried using C-47 transport planes to fly in fuel. But think about this, a C-47 could carry maybe 2,000 gallons of fuel. Sounds like a lot, right? Except the plane itself burned 1,000 gallons making the round trip. So you're burning fuel to deliver fuel. Not exactly efficient. This is where things get desperate. It's late August 1944, and the top brass realizes that if they don't solve this problem immediately, the entire Western Front is going to freeze in place. The Germans will have time to regroup, build new defensive lines, and the war could drag on for years. Enter Colonel Charles Lanham. This guy looks at the situation and says, "Forget the railways. Forget the procedures. We're going to do this with trucks." People thought he was crazy. The distance was too far. There weren't enough trucks. The roads were destroyed. But Lanham had an idea. What if they took every available truck, and I mean every single one, and ran them in a continuous loop? No stops except for fuel. No waiting for paperwork. Just load up at the beaches, drive like hell to the front, dump the supplies and race back for more. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from railroad terminology. A red ball meant express freight, top priority, everything else gets out of the way. And that's exactly what this was going to be. On August 25, 1944, the Red Ball Express officially began. The plan was simple but insane. They marked out two parallel one-way highways using red ball signs. One route going to the front, one coming back. Any vehicle not part of the Red Ball Express was forbidden from using these roads. Military police were stationed every few miles to keep civilian traffic off and help broken-down trucks. Here's where it gets interesting. They needed 6,000 trucks for this operation. But there was a problem, they didn't have 6,000 truck drivers. So they grabbed anyone who could drive. Cooks, clerks, infantry soldiers waiting for deployment. They pulled guys out of replacement depots and said, "Congratulations, you're now a truck driver." Most of these guys had never driven anything bigger than a Jeep. Now they're behind the wheel of a 2.5-ton GMC truck. They called them Jimmy trucks, loaded with ammunition or jerry cans full of gasoline. One driver later said the first time he got in the truck, he didn't even know how to shift gears. He learned by watching the guy in front of him. But here's the part that really matters, and it's something a lot of history books gloss over. About 75% of the Red Ball Express drivers were African American soldiers. This was 1944, remember? The U.S. Army was still segregated. Black soldiers were mostly kept in support roles, not allowed in combat units. The military didn't think they could fight. These guys were about to prove everyone wrong. See, driving the Red Ball Express wasn't some cushy rear area job. These trucks were carrying ammunition and gasoline, basically rolling bombs. The Germans knew exactly how important this supply line was. They sent fighter planes to strafe the convoys. They dropped paratroopers behind Allied lines to ambush trucks. They even dressed German soldiers in American uniforms to misdirect convoys into ambushes. The drivers had no armor protection. Most trucks didn't even have weapons mounted on them. When a Messerschmitt fighter came screaming down with its guns blazing, all you could do was jump out and hope the truck didn't explode with you next to it. One driver, Private John Houston, was hauling ammunition when German planes attacked his convoy. The truck in front of him took a direct hit and basically disintegrated. Houston jumped out of his cab as bullets tore through where he'd been sitting. He spent the next hour in a ditch while the Germans shot up his truck. When they finally left, he got back in, the engine somehow still worked, and delivered what was left of his cargo. But enemy attacks were just one problem. The bigger enemy was exhaustion. The schedule was absolutely brutal. Drivers were supposed to be on the road for 20 hours straight, then get 4 hours of sleep. That's it. But even that was a joke because delays meant you might drive for 36 hours without stopping. Picture this. You're driving a fully loaded truck through the French countryside. It's 2 a.m. You haven't slept in 2 days. The road is barely more than a dirt track full of holes from bombing. No headlights allowed because of German night fighters. The guy behind you is so close you can hear his engine over yours. And if you slow down or stop, you're holding up supplies that soldiers are literally dying for. Drivers started hallucinating from exhaustion. They'd see German soldiers that weren't there. Trees would look like tanks. One driver swore he saw his truck flying above the road. They developed a system where the passenger, if you had one, would punch the driver in the arm every few minutes to keep him awake. Some guys tied strings from their wrists to the steering wheel so if they dozed off and their hands dropped, the string would yank them awake. Others would purposely drive close to the edge of the road so if they started drifting, the bumps would wake them up. Except sometimes they'd drift too far and roll the truck into a ditch. The accident rate was horrifying. Trucks would plow into each other because drivers fell asleep. They'd miss turns and drive off cliffs. One convoy lost 6 trucks in a single night, not to enemy action, just exhaustion. The trucks were going so fast on such bad roads that they were literally shaking apart. Tires would explode from the constant use. Engines would overheat and catch fire. The mechanics were working around the clock trying to keep these trucks running. They didn't have enough spare parts so they'd cannibalize wrecked trucks. Need a transmission? Pull it from that truck that went off the road yesterday. Engine blown? Take one from the truck that got strafed last week. They set up maintenance points along the route where mechanics would swarm over trucks during the few minutes drivers stopped for fuel. Oil changes were done in under 3 minutes. Tires were changed while the engine was still running. One mechanic said they got so good at it, they could practically rebuild an engine blindfolded. But here's what's amazing, it worked. In the first week alone, the Red Ball Express delivered 12,500 tons of supplies. That's not a weekly total that built up over time. That's week 1 while they were still figuring things out. The drivers developed their own culture and their own rules. Official military discipline went out the window. Uniforms? Forget it. Guys drove in whatever was comfortable. Rank didn't matter. A private with truck experience was worth more than a lieutenant who couldn't drive. They painted their trucks with nicknames and slogans. Detroit Iron was popular. So was Hitler's Nightmare. They had their own slang too. A truck carrying fuel was a gas wagon. Ammunition trucks were boom boxes. When your truck broke down, you were dead on the Red Ball. And if you were going really fast, you were highballing, which is where the Express got its reputation. The speed these guys maintained was insane. The official speed limit was 25 miles per hour. Most drivers doubled that. On good stretches of road, they'd hit 60 or even 70. Remember, these are 1940s trucks with terrible brakes, no power steering, carrying explosive cargo on war-torn roads. There's this famous story about a colonel who tried to enforce the speed limit. He set up a checkpoint and started pulling over trucks for speeding. Within an hour, he had such a massive traffic jam that supplies to the entire First Army were backing up. A general called him personally and told him to get those trucks moving or he'd be directing traffic in Berlin as a private. The checkpoint disappeared real quick. The French civilians were both terrified and amazed. These massive convoys would come roaring through villages at all hours. Buildings would shake. Windows would rattle. Kids would run out to wave at the drivers who'd throw them chocolate bars and cigarettes. Though more than a few French farmers complained about trucks plowing through their fields when drivers fell asleep and went off the road. One French mayor tried to set up a roadblock to slow down the trucks because they were damaging his town's ancient bridge. The lead driver of the next convoy simply drove around the roadblock, through the mayor's garden, and kept going. The mayor complained to the Allied command and was basically told, "We're trying to win a war here." But the real heroes were the African-American drivers who made up the majority of the Red Ball Express. These guys were dealing with racism from their own army while trying to keep the war effort moving. White officers would give them the worst trucks, the most dangerous routes, the least support. And still they delivered. There's this incredible story about Sergeant William McNeil. His convoy got ambushed by German paratroopers. Instead of abandoning the trucks like they were supposed to, McNeil organized his drivers into a defensive position. These were truck drivers, remember, not combat troops. But they fought off the Germans for 3 hours until reinforcements arrived. McNeil got a Bronze Star for that action. Another driver, Corporal James Roberson, was hauling ammunition when his convoy got hit by German artillery. Shrapnel tore through his leg, but he kept driving. Blood pooling in the cab, he drove another 50 miles to deliver his cargo before he'd let medics look at him. His reasoning? If I stop, the whole convoy stops. And if the convoy stops, soldiers don't get bullets. These drivers were changing military thinking in real time. The army had always assumed black soldiers couldn't handle pressure, couldn't be trusted with important jobs. But here they were, literally keeping the entire Allied advance moving. General Eisenhower himself said the Red Ball Express was one of the most important operations of the war. By September, the operation was absolutely massive. They were running 900 trucks per day at the start. By the peak, it was nearly 6,000 trucks every single day. They were delivering 12,500 tons of supplies daily. To put that in perspective, that's about 250 railway cars worth of supplies, every single day delivered by truck. The Germans couldn't believe it. They'd calculated that the Allies couldn't possibly advance this far this fast because the logistics were impossible. German intelligence kept reporting that the Allied advance would have to stop any day now because they'd run out of supplies. But the supplies kept coming. One captured German officer said he knew the war was lost when he saw the Red Ball Express. He said, "Any army that can move that much material that fast, with that much organization, cannot be defeated." He was watching from a hidden position as convoy after convoy rolled past for hours. He stopped counting trucks after 500. But the human cost was adding up. By October, drivers were completely worn out. The accident rate was climbing. Trucks were breaking down faster than they could be repaired. The mechanical toll was incredible, they were going through tires at an astronomical rate. Engines designed to last 10,000 miles were dying after 2,000. There's this heartbreaking account from a driver named Charles Stevens. He talked about watching his best friend die in a wreck. The guy had been driving for 40 straight hours and fell asleep at the wheel. His truck went off a cliff. Stevens said the worst part was they couldn't even stop to help. The convoy had to keep moving. They just marked the location and kept driving. The stress was breaking people. Drivers were getting into fights over nothing. Some guys just walked away, refusing to drive anymore. Military police would find them and drag them back, but what could you really do? Court-martial a guy for being too exhausted to function? One lieutenant wrote in his report that his drivers were operating on pure willpower and benzodrine. Yeah, benzodrine, basically amphetamines. The army was handing out speed pills like candy to keep drivers awake. Guys would take a handful of pills, drive for 2 days straight, then crash so hard they couldn't be woken up with a bucket of cold water. The Red Ball Express also created massive black market opportunities. Think about it, you've got thousands of trucks carrying everything from cigarettes to gasoline to coffee, driven by exhausted guys who haven't been paid properly in months. Stuff went missing. A lot of stuff. Trucks would arrive with half their cargo gone. Must have fallen off, drivers would say. Right. French civilians would trade wine, food, and other favors for American supplies. One driver admitted years later that he made enough money selling stolen gasoline to buy a house after the war. The military tried to crack down on it, but honestly they couldn't push too hard. These drivers were already doing an impossible job under impossible conditions. You start arresting them for theft, and who's going to drive the trucks? By November 1944, the situation was changing. The front lines had stabilized somewhat. Engineers had repaired enough rail lines that trains could start taking some of the load. The port of Antwerp was about to open, which would shorten supply lines dramatically. The Red Ball Express was scheduled to end. But then December 16, 1944 happened. The Germans launched their last major offensive, what we now call the Battle of the Bulge. Suddenly, the Allies needed emergency supplies rushed to the front. Guess who got the call? The Red Ball Express drivers were told they had one more job. In the middle of the worst winter Europe had seen in decades, with snow making roads nearly impassable, they had to rush ammunition and fuel to troops surrounded by Germans. These guys had already been driving for months with barely any rest. Their trucks were held together with wire and prayers. And now they had to drive through blizzards, on icy roads, with German forces specifically targeting supply convoys. One convoy got caught in a blizzard so bad they couldn't see 5 feet ahead. The lead driver, Sergeant Marcus Williams, got out and walked in front of his truck, guiding it by hand through the snow. The entire convoy followed, crawling along at walking speed for 6 hours. When they finally delivered their ammunition, the receiving officer said it arrived just as they were down to their last rounds. Another driver, Private Earl Davis, was hauling fuel when German tanks cut the road behind him. He was trapped between enemy forces with 5 trucks full of gasoline. Instead of surrendering or abandoning the trucks, he led his convoy off-road, through a forest, basically making his own route. They got lost, spent a night hiding from German patrols, and somehow delivered the fuel the next morning. The Battle of the Bulge proved what everyone already knew: without the Red Ball Express, the Allied army couldn't function. These truck drivers weren't just delivering supplies. They were the lifeline that kept the entire war effort alive. When the Red Ball Express officially ended on November 16, 1944, the statistics were staggering. In just 82 days, they had delivered over 412,000 tons of supplies. The trucks had covered 122 million ton-miles. That's like driving to the moon and back 250 times. But the numbers don't tell the human story. Hundreds of drivers died. Some from enemy action, some from accidents, some literally worked to death. Thousands more were injured. And pretty much every single driver who survived had some kind of permanent health issue from the exhaustion and stress. Here's what makes me angry about this story. After the war, the Red Ball Express drivers came home to a segregated America. These men who had kept the Allied armies moving, who had proven beyond any doubt their courage and ability, still couldn't eat at the same restaurants as white soldiers. They couldn't use the same bathrooms. Many couldn't even get jobs as truck drivers in civilian life because companies wouldn't hire black drivers. The official military histories barely mention them for decades. When movies were made about World War II, the Red Ball Express was usually ignored or reduced to a footnote. It took until the 1990s for these drivers to start getting any real recognition. But their impact on the war was undeniable. General Patton, who was not exactly known for praising support troops, said the Red Ball Express was the most magnificent job of transportation ever accomplished. Without them, the liberation of France would have taken months longer, maybe years. How many more people would have died in concentration camps? How many more cities would have been destroyed? The Red Ball Express also revolutionized military logistics forever. It proved that trucks could replace railways in modern warfare. Every military in the world studied what these drivers accomplished and redesigned their supply systems. The modern military convoy system? That comes directly from the Red Ball Express. Some of the drivers went on to have incredible careers after the war. William Rutledge used his Red Ball experience to start a trucking company that became one of the largest black-owned businesses in America. James Ruckert became a civil rights activist, using his military service to fight for equality. He used to say, "I kept Patton's army moving in France. Don't tell me I can't drink from this water fountain." Many drivers never talked about their service. The trauma, the exhaustion, the constant fear, it was too much. One veteran's son said his father would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night, thinking he was still driving, hands gripping an invisible steering wheel. There's a monument now in France, dedicated to the Red Ball Express. It's a simple stone marker by the side of what used to be one of the main routes. French locals still put flowers there. Some of them remember being kids, watching those endless convoys roar past, throwing up clouds of dust, the drivers looking like ghosts behind the wheel. An old French woman who lived near the route said something that really stuck with me. She said, "We knew liberation was real when we saw those trucks. Not the tanks, not the soldiers. The trucks. Because an army that could move that many trucks that fast was an army that would not be stopped. The last surviving Red Ball Express reunion was in 2009. Only a handful of drivers were still alive, all in their 80s and 90s. They told stories, laughed about the crazy things they'd done, and mourned the friends who didn't make it home. One of them said something that perfectly captures what these men accomplished. We weren't heroes. We were just truck drivers. But we drove through hell to win a war. Today, military historians consider the Red Ball Express one of the greatest logistics operations in military history. It proved that wars aren't just won by generals and soldiers at the front. They're won by the people who make sure those soldiers have bullets, food, and fuel. They're won by exhausted truck drivers, mechanics covered in grease, and supply clerks working through the night. The Red Ball Express moved 412,000 tons of supplies in 82 days. But more than that, it moved history. Without those drivers, many of them facing discrimination from their own country, the Allies might not have won the war when they did. Every major city in Western Europe that was liberated in 1944 instead of 1945 owes something to those men behind the wheels of those Jimmy trucks. So the next time you hear about World War II, remember it wasn't just about the battles. Remember the guys who drove until they hallucinated, who kept going with German bullets flying past their heads, who delivered the ammunition just as the last round was fired. Remember the Red Ball Express, the truck drivers who literally drove the Allies to victory. It's a story that deserves to be told again and again. Because sometimes the most important heroes are the ones just trying to deliver the goods, no matter what stands in their way. These men didn't storm beaches or liberate cities. They just drove trucks. But without them, none of those famous victories would have been possible. The Red Ball Express proved something fundamental about warfare and maybe about life itself: logistics wins wars. Not strategy, not tactics, not even courage, though all those matter. But at the end of the day, the side that can get the most stuff to where it needs to be, when it needs to be there, that's the side that wins. And in 1944, nobody did that better than the drivers of the Red Ball Express. Subscribe for more untold stories from history.